We begin south of the border, where more than 60,500 new COVID-19 infections were reported across the U.S. on Thursday alone. That country once again setting a one-day record. And as the situation worsens, the pandemic is also becoming increasingly politicized. With more on this, let's bring in our Washington Bureau Chief, Jackson Proskow. Jackson, always a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Good morning, Anthony.
I want to get to the numbers, and they are staggering. Infections rose in 41 out of the 50 states. This is over the past 2 weeks. Break down some of the hot spots for us right now.
Yeah, we already know that states like Texas, Arizona, Florida, and California are hotspots, but now the outbreak is popping up in new places with increasing speed. States like Missouri, Utah, Montana have all set new daily records for infection. And what this suggests is that the pandemic is widespread, and essentially it is moving in waves throughout the country, being reseeded in places that thought they already had this under control, as states like Texas and Florida record massive numbers of new cases. In Texas yesterday alone, 11,000 new cases. And then Anthony, just as those case numbers are rising, so are the rates of hospitalization and death. Texas and Florida and Arizona all setting daily records for the number of new deaths. And we know those are things that lag weeks behind the initial infections.
So these are some of the worst hit states, and you contrast that with states like New York, one of the earliest hit and in devastating numbers, but they seem to have more or less gotten it under control, and it highlights so many things, doesn't it? How this is operated from a state level in the absence of real national strategy.
That's right. It really is a patchwork of response right across the country. Of course, the fear now is that in a place like New York, which you're right, has brought this under control, things are relatively steady there. The fear is that this is going to be reseeded in those communities, and they'll start to see the case numbers tick up, both as people travel in from hotspots and as that state goes through its own reopening process. Just last week, in fact, the mayor of New York pumped the brakes on the reopening plan and said they will not return to indoor dining at all. That is not something that is on the table any longer. So it gives you a sense that states are having to scale back and modify their plans simply because if one part of the country is sick, the entire country is at risk of getting sick.
Now, politics so intertwined with all this. Are we seeing this, a lot of the resistance to the reversing of the reopening plans? Are we seeing that kind of state by state, or where these states where they have high numbers, are they acknowledging that finally we have to maybe rethink this?
No, you've seen Florida, for example, the governor who was slow to shut down, quick to reopen, and now says the state will not move backward. He has been reluctant to implement any sort of statewide face covering mandate, for example. He has refused to lock back down or shut down certain business segments, even as that state runs out of ICU beds, records records numbers of deaths and hospitalizations and new cases. And so instead, what you're seeing are local officials step up and bring in their own measures. So in Miami, for example, which has a positivity rate of an astonishing 33% right now, the city has stepped in. They've shut down restaurants and bars. They're trying to shut down gyms again. They've brought in mask mandates there. But Anthony, it gets really complicated in other states where governors have barred local officials from bringing in any measure that's stricter than what the state itself is doing, and that is preventing some local officials from doing things like mask mandates.
What about the issue of schools and the talk of reopening them, because this is in less than 2 months? Where is that going, and the politics sort of behind the conflicting opinions?
Well, the president definitely wants schools to reopen this fall, but it's hard to see how that's realistic. New York, which again probably has the best handle on this situation right now, has said they will only return to sort of a hybrid model where kids alternate days at school to reduce the numbers of students in the school, and that is assuming that it's safe to go ahead with that. There's a lot of questions, of course, as to whether or not it's safe. The Centers for Disease Control has developed guidelines which, much like their general reopening guidelines, have been met by very few states. The White House at times has said the CDC guidelines are too strict. At one point, the CDC was going to redraft those guidelines. Now they're not going to. But the White House has said that CDC guidelines should not be an excuse for any school to stay closed. Again, though, Anthony, there's so much we don't know about how children spread the virus or contract the virus or suffer from the virus, whether they might bring it home to their parents, that it's very hard to see how in a state like Florida or Texas, where school goes back in August, how that's realistic.
Now, speaking of Florida, the president is in that state today to talk about drug trafficking. He obviously will, I assume, face a number of questions on this, but has spoken little in many ways and continues to drive home the message, doesn't he, about the increased testing, which is the cause of the increased numbers. Talk about that and the response and the reaction.
And of course, we know that's simply not true. If increased testing was all that was responsible for increased numbers, then you wouldn't see more people end up in the hospital and more people dying. And those are things that we are, in fact, seeing. Increased testing is simply exposing the cases that are out there. And by the estimation of the Centers for Disease Control, not coming anywhere close to exposing all of the cases that are out there at this point. You're right, though. The president continues to downplay this. At times this week, he has said everything's going great, that this will disappear on its own. We know those things are both highly unlikely at this point. The president, though, seems to be wanting to talk about anything but the coronavirus response. And some new polling out this morning might explain why. 2/3 of all Americans disapprove of Trump's handling of the coronavirus crisis. And Anthony, we know Election Day is just a few short months away.
Now, speaking of Election Day, as far as I know, it's still going on, the rally tomorrow in New Hampshire, correct?
That's right, and local officials there had weighed whether or not they were going to require face masks. What's different about this rally, though, is it's in an airplane hangar, which essentially means it's a covered outdoor space. They can open up the doors and get better ventilation. It won't be an indoor arena, but still lots of concern about this because we now know, based on what officials in Tulsa, Oklahoma are telling us, that Trump's rally there is likely responsible for a surge in cases in that city.
All right, lots more to come with this. Jackson, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Jackson Proskow joining us from Washington.
Thank you.